Mary Poppins in the Park by P.L. Travers, Chapter 2, The Faithful Friends. "Faster, please," said Mary Poppins, tapping on the glass panel with the beak of her parrot-headed umbrella. Jane and Michael had spent the morning at the barber shop and the dentist's, and because it was late, as a great treat, they were taking a taxi home. The taxi man stared straight before him and gave his head a shake. "If I go any faster," he shouted, "it'll make me late for my dinner. For me dinner." "Why?" demanded Jane through the window. It seemed such a silly thing to say. Surely the quicker a taxi man drove, the earlier he would arrive. "Why?" echoed the taxi man, keeping his eye on the wheel. "An accident, that's why. If I go any faster, I'll run into something. And that'll be an accident. And an accident, it's plain enough, will make me late for dinner. Oh, dear!" he exclaimed as he put on the brake. "Red again, I see." He turned and put his head through the window. His bulgy eyes and drooping whiskers made him look like a seal. "There's always trouble at these here signals." He waved his hand at the stream of cars, all waiting for the lights to change, and now it was Michael who asked him why. "Don't you know nothing?" the taxi man cried. "It's because of the chap on duty." He pointed to the signal box where a helmeted figure with his head on his hand was gazing into the distance. "Absent-minded, that's what he is. Always staring and moping. And half the time he forgets the lights. I've known them to stay red for a whole morning. If it's going to be like that today, I'll never get me dinner. You haven't got a sandwich, have you?" He looked at Michael hopefully. "No, nor a chocolate drop?" Jane smiled and shook her head. The taxi man sighed despondently. "Nobody thinks of nobody these days." "I'm thinking of someone," said Mary Poppins, and she looked so stern and disapproving that he turned away in dismay. "They're green!" he cried as he looked at the lights again. And, huffing nervously over the wheel, he drove along Park Avenue as though pursued by wolves. Bump, bump, rattle, rattle. The three of them jolted and bounced in their seats. "Sit up straight," said Mary Poppins, sliding into a corner. "You are not a couple of jack-in-the-boxes." "I know I'm not," said Michael, gasping, "but I feel like one and my bones are shaking." He gulped quickly and bit his tongue and left the sentence unfinished, for the taxi had stopped with a frightful jerk and flung them all to the floor. "Mary Poppins," said Jane in a muffled voice, "I think you're sitting on me." My foot, it's caught in something." "I'll thank you, Michael," said Mary Poppins, "to take it out of my hat." She rose majestically from the floor, seizing her parrot-headed umbrella, sprang out onto the pavement. "Well, you said to go faster," the taxi man muttered, as she thrust the fare into his hand. She glared at him in offended silence, and, in order to escape that look, he shrank himself down inside his collar so that nothing was left but his whiskers. "Don't bother about a tip," he begged. "It's really been a pleasure." "I had no intention of bothering." She opened the gate of number 17 with an angry flick of her hand. The taxi man started up his engine and jerked away down the lane. "She's upset me, that's what she's done," he murmured. "If I don't get home in time for me dinner, I shan't be able to eat it." Mary Poppins tripped up the path, followed by Jane and Michael. Mrs. Banks stood in the front hall, looking up at the stairs. "Oh, do be careful, Robertson, eh?" she was saying anxiously. He was carrying a cardboard box and lurching slowly from stair to stair as though he were almost asleep. "Never a moment's peace," he muttered. "First it's one thing, then another. There." He gave a sleepy heave, thrust the package into the nursery, and fell in a snoring heap on the landing. Jane dashed upstairs to look at the label. "What's in it? A present?" shouted Michael. The twins, bursting with curiosity, were jumping up and down, and Annabelle peered through her cot railing and banged her rattle loudly. "Is this a nursery or a bear pit?" Mary Poppins stepped over Robertson A. as she hurried into the room. "A bear pit," Michael longed to answer, but he caught her eye and refrained. "Really?" Mrs. Banks protested as she stumbled over Robertson A. "He chooses such inconvenient places. Oh, gently, children, do be careful. That box belongs to Miss Andrew." Miss Andrew, their faces fell. "Then it isn't presents," said Michael blankly. He gave the box a push. "It's probably full of medicine bottles," said Jane in a bitter voice. "It's not," said Mrs. Banks. "Miss Andrew has sent us all her treasures, and I thought, Mary Poppins," she She glanced at the stiff white shape beside her. I thought perhaps you could keep them here. She nodded toward the mantelpiece. Mary Poppins regarded her in silence. If a pin had fallen, you could have heard it. Am I an octopus? She inquired, finding her voice at last. An octopus? Cried Mrs. Banks. Had she even suggested such a thing? Of course not, Mary Poppins. Of course you're not, Mary Poppins. Exactly, Mary Poppins retorted. I have only one pair of hands. Mrs. Banks nodded uneasily. She never expected her to have more. And one pair has enough to do without dusting anyone's treasures. But Mary Poppins, I never dreamed. Mrs. Banks was getting more and more flustered. Ellen is here to do the dusting, and it's only until Miss Andrew comes back. If, of course, she ever does. She behaved so strangely when she was here. Why are you giggling, Jane? But Jane only snickered and shook her head. She remembered that strange behavior. Where has she gone to? Michael said. She seems to have had a sort of shock. What are you laughing at, children? The doctor has ordered a long voyage away to the South Seas, she says. Mrs. Banks fished into her pocket and brought out a crumpled letter. And while I am away, she read out, I shall leave my valuables with you. Be sure they are put in a safe place where nothing can happen to them. I shall expect on my return to find everything exactly as it is. Nothing broken, nothing mended. Tell George to wear his overcoat. The weather is changeable. So you see, Mary Poppins, said Mrs. Banks, looking up with a flattering smile, the nursery does seem the best place. Anything left in your charge is always perfectly safe. There's safety and safety, sniffed Mary Poppins. And I hope I see further than my nose. It was tilted upward as she spoke, even more than usual. Oh, I am sure you do, murmured Mrs. Banks, wondering for the 100th time why Mary Poppins, no matter what the situation, was always so pleased with herself. Well, now I think I must go and... But without saying what she was going to do, she ran out of the nursery, jumped over Robertson A's legs, and bustled away down the stairs. Allow me, Michael, if you please. Mary Poppins seized his wrist as he pulled the lid off the box. Remember what curiosity did? It killed the cat, you know. Her quick hands darted among the papers and briskly unwrapped a little bundle. Out came a bird with a chipped nose and a Chelsea china lamb. Funny sort of treasures, said Michael. I could mend the bird with a piece of putty, but I mustn't, so Miss Andrews said. They're to stay exactly as they are. Nothing does that, said Mary Poppins with a priggish look on her face. You do, he insisted gallantly. She sniffed and glanced at the nursery mirror. Her reflection gave a similar sort of sniff and glanced at Mary Poppins. Each of them, it was easy to see, highly approved of the other. I wonder why she kept this. Jane took out an old cracked tile from the box. The picture showed a boatload of people rowing toward an island. To remind her of her youth, said Michael. To give me more trouble, snapped Mary Poppins, shaking the dust from another wrapping. Back and forth the children ran, collecting and setting up the treasures. A cottage in a snowstorm with Home Sweet Home on the glass globe, a pottery hen with a yellow nest, a red and white china clown, a winged horse of celluloid prancing on its hind legs, a flower vase in the shape of a swan, a little red fox of carved wood, an egg-shaped piece of polished granite, a painted apple with a boy and girl playing together inside it, a roughly made, full-rigged ship in a jam jar. I hope that's all, grumbled Michael. The mantelpiece is crowded. Only one more, said Mary Poppins. She drew out a knobbly bundle. A couple of china ornaments came forth from the paper wrapper. Her eyebrows went up as she looked at them and gave a little shrug. Then she handed one each to Jane and Michael. Weary of running back and forth, they set the ornaments hurriedly on either end of the mantelpiece. Then Jane looked at hers and blinked her eyes. A china lion, with his paw on the chest of a china huntsman, was reclining beneath a banana tree, which of course was also china. The man and the animal leaned together, smiling blissfully. Never, thought Jane, in all her life had she seen two happier creatures. He reminds me of somebody, she exclaimed as she gazed at the smiling huntsman. Such a manly figure he looked, too, in his spruce blue jacket and black top boots. Yes, agreed Michael. Who can it be? He frowned as he tried to recall the name. Then he looked at his half of the china pair and gave a cry of dismay. "Oh, Jane, what a pity! My lion has lost his huntsman." It was true. There stood another banana tree, there sat another painted lion, but in the other huntsman's place there was only a gap of roughened china. All that remained of his manly shape was one black shiny boot. "Poor lion," said Michael. "He looks so sad." And indeed, there was no denying it. Jane's lion was wreathed in smiles, but his brother had such a dejected look that he seemed to be almost in tears. "You'll be looking sad in a minute unless you get ready for lunch." Mary Poppins' face was so like her voice that they ran to obey her without a word. But they caught a glimpse as they rushed away of her starched white figure standing there. With its arms full of crumpled paper, she was gazing with a reflective smile at Miss Andrews' broken treasure, and it seemed to them that her lips moved. Michael gave Jane a fleeting grin. "I expect she's only saying humph." But Jane was not so sure, and we will pause there.